This video was made with support from my patrons, whose names are on screen now. If you want to, you can join them today and even get access to exclusive content. The link to my Patreon is in the description, so check it out if you're interested. Anyway, on with the show. A couple of months ago, I made a video breaking down some of the most interesting cut and hidden cars in Gran Turismo. Given that, I guess you won't be too surprised to learn that we can also do the same thing when it comes to the racetracks. Much like the cars, this series has featured a huge amount of tracks to drive on over its many different games, be them real-world circuits, entirely fictional ones, or a mixture of the two. But as you can guess, not all of the circuits that were designed for these games ended up making it into the final product. Today, we're going to discuss those that didn't, and in some cases, why they didn't make it in, but also the interesting ways in which they were even discovered. If you watched my Hidden Cars video, you'll know how this works. We're going to go down the list by game, starting with the game that has the least interesting, but still pretty interesting, hidden and unused tracks, all the way through to the ones that are kind of mind-blowing. And a reminder, we'll only be looking at tracks that have some form of physical evidence, whether those be screenshots, videos, or the fact that they still partially exist in the final game. Well, let's get started. Man, I feel like I say this in every video, but where better to start than the original Gran Turismo? Let's cut to the chase. GT1 has, for the most part, one noteworthy hidden track. And here it is. This track is simply titled End, and takes the form of a large anti-clockwise circle with some elevation changes. On the right side of the circuit, you'll find a continuous stone wall with some trees just behind it. On the left side, however, is just an empty void. This circuit is unused in the final game, but still present in the files. So what was its original purpose? Well, we can't say for certain, but it's believed that this track was intended to be used in the ending credits. Specifically, this final scene, which has the Nismo GTR LM driving over a hill into the sunset. In the final game, this is entirely FMV, not made using in-game assets. But the presence of the sunset skybox, as well as of course the name End, all points to the possibility that this track was created for that purpose instead, but was ultimately left unused. Still, this wouldn't be the final time that a track would be created for the explicit purpose of being seen, but never driven on. Fast forward some 20 years and we would see something similar in GT Sport. Take a look at this. This is the layout of a circuit in GT Sports that you have likely never seen before. But even if you've never seen this full layout, it is very possible that you have seen the track itself. When a new content update for GT Sport was dropped, you would be able to see footage of the new cars being driven on the main menu. And the forest location where the cars are seen driving is this circuit, labelled as PWY_forest_config in the game files. In fact, a YouTube account by the name of Vanilla has even uploaded a handful of videos showing that the track can be made drivable when using a jailbroken PS4. Vanilla's channel is a goldmine when it comes to this sort of strange GT Sport content, so make sure to take a look if you're interested in that sort of stuff. Honestly, this track looks pretty fun to drive. It's like an actual narrow rally stage, something that's very rare in Gran Turismo. It does make me wonder if this track was ever intended to be a fully drivable circuit in the main game at one point, before being relegated to its use in these menu demos. But there are a couple more unused circuit variations in GT Sport. One of the locations new to Sport was Kyoto Driving Park. The name Driving Park will be very familiar to players of Gran Turismo 4, as that location was where a handful of the circuits in the game could be found, those being the Test Course, Beginner Course, Motorland, and the infamous Gymkhana area. Anyway, the inclusion of Driving Park in the name of this new location always seemed a bit superfluous. What exactly did these two circuits have to do with the original Driving Park? Well, in January 2018, that link became a little bit stronger. Kyoto Driving Park Square, or KDPS for short, was discovered as an unused circuit variation in GT Sport. Essentially, it was just a wide open area of asphalt, much like Driving Park Gymkhana from GT4. The space is located just next to the Miyabi course, as can be seen by one of the camera angles shown on the pre-race menu. Ultimately, KDPS was never made playable in the game, so its true purpose is still unknown. That said, people have speculated that it possibly could have been intended to host coffee break challenges, much like GT4, or some sort of autocross/gymkhana style events. But speaking of autocross and gymkhana, that ties in neatly with our final unused track in GT Sports. Northern Isle Speedway is a short oval circuit that debuted in this game. But alongside the oval course, it also had a handful of point-to-point courses taking place on the infield. These were used solely in the Northern Isle Festival mission challenges, and despite Northern Isle returning in GT7, they remain exclusive to GT Sports. But we do know about another variation of this circuit that was never used at all. And unlike the previous hidden circuits, this one wasn't discovered by digging into the game, but rather a much more obvious way. The original intro to GT Sport featured a scene showing the Ford Focus Group B rally car at Northern Isle Speedway. However, this is a layout that clearly didn't make it into the final game, as it takes place on the oval section, but with barriers put in place to form a new layout. If we analyse the video, we can see that after coming off the banking, there is a hairpin left leading to a short straight into a hairpin right. Then another straight before you encounter 3 barriers which form a chicane, after which you then head onto the banking again. It's possible that this layout was originally intended for the Northern Isle Festival, before being cut out or even replaced entirely by the infield layouts we see in the final game. Regardless, the fact that this version is seen in the intro to the game implies that the decision to remove it came quite late, but sadly there is no other trace of it left in the final release. Gran Turismo 3 has a few hidden and unused circuits, but for the most part these are fairly ordinary. Either random short circuits with little to no scenery, or early versions of circuits from the final game. There are a few highlights though, like this strange figure 8 circuit for example. Another one would be this, Special Stage Route 11. Once again, it is an early version of a circuit that would appear in GT3, but what's interesting about it is how it differs from the version in the final game. Special Stage Route 11 appeared in only GT1 and GT3, but when it returned in the latter, it had its layout altered. The section of track that ran underneath the pit straight, featuring the original Death Chicane, had been blocked off, and was instead replaced with this simplified above ground section instead. But if we check out some of the demo versions of GT3, we can find a hidden version of the track with the original layout from GT1. The earliest version of this is in the GT3 Autobax Replay Theatre, which has a build that dates back to September 2000. It was also present but unused in a handful more demos after this, up until the Playable Store Demo Volume 2, which is dated to the end of December 2000. After this, it appears as though it was modified to create the version we're all familiar with from GT3. Gran Turismo Concept released in 2002 and was a game based on GT3. That said, it had its own slew of interesting hidden circuits. If you saw my video covering pretty much all of the known Gran Turismo games, you will remember how I mentioned that the ultra-rare Lupo Cup training version was the first Gran Turismo to feature Tsukuba circuits. Now, this is still true, but what I didn't mention is that the normal GT concept does actually feature a very early version of the same circuit hidden within it. It is literally just the basic road layout, no scenery or other details, and would be far more complete by the time of the Lupo Cup training version, where it would be made playable. In GT Concept, there would also be this, a hidden dirt track labelled as demo_up-down in the game files. As you can see, its layout is quite similar to Tsukuba for whatever reason, and the name implies it was most likely intended for testing how cars react to elevation changes. But sticking with the theme of real-world Japanese circuits, we have Suzuka. This track would debut in GT4, but once again, a very basic version of it is left unused in GT Concept. And to round off the trio, we also have the Motegi Road Course. This one is the most detailed of the three, as it has a pit lane divider wall, not just for the main pits, but also one for the east course, as well as a starting line gantry for both. But to finish up with GT Concept, we have one more circuit, one which has never appeared in any GT game after this, and it's a real circuit. It's called Motegi South. Yep, just a few hundred meters from the main Motegi road course, you can find this small layout, which is pretty much just some white lines painted onto an open area of tarmac. In that sense, it's not too different from Driving Park Gymkhana in GT4, so maybe that's why it never returned. Either way, it's unlikely that had it actually featured, it would have been used for proper racing, given the liberties that can be taken with its layout. Also, for whatever reason, its minimap has a green to red transition. Oh, and in case you're wondering, as there is a Motegi East course, West course, and South course, there is also a Motegi North course in real life. Like the South course, it's separate from the main layout and is mainly used for karting, but has never appeared in any Gran Turismo game, even in secret. After GT Concept came Gran Turismo 4 Prologue, and whilst we're on the theme of unfinished tracks, we might as well continue there. As you might expect by now, GT4 Prologue contained unfinished versions of many tracks that would appear in GT4. But, more specifically, the Prius trial version of the game is where a lot of the good stuff can be found. For example, we have a very early version of the Nordschleifer, as well as Motegi back again, still unfinished but with a bit more detail than it had in GT Concept. But it gets even better. GT3 had quite a unique version of Grand Valley Speedway, particularly when it comes to the turns 7, 8, 9 combination. Have you ever wondered what Grand Valley would have looked like in GT3 had they used the same layout as GT1 and 2, and then from GT4 onwards? Well, with the Prius trial version, we can find out. Note how the tarmac changes before the fast left-hander, and then again later in the tunnel. We can also see some remodelling being done for Grand Valley East, which didn't appear in GT3 but returned for GT4. Oh, and if that weren't already enough, we also get to see GT4's version of the iconic Blue Bridge pasted onto GT3's Grand Valley. Pretty surreal, but it's about to get even stranger. Here is Special Stage Route 5. Once again, it's sort of a hybrid between the GT3 and GT4 versions, but it also has some details that we don't see in either game. For one, the time of day. In GT3 and 4, it seems to be at dusk, whereas here the sun hasn't yet set, and there are also some ominous dark clouds. But even without that, the lighting feels off. Instead of the familiar warm yellow-orange glow in the tunnel, it's a much colder greenish hue. There's also the elevated road which you pass under a couple of times. In the GT4 Prologue version, that road begins much sooner and you pass under it 2 more times. But the biggest difference has to be the pit straight. On the left, it retains the pit lane of GT3, where you have the main grandstand above it, but the top of the structure has been redesigned and features a much bigger overhang. And then on the right, the buildings are completely different and a bit closer to the track. All of this gives a more narrow, claustrophobic feeling to it. It's hard to say how many of these changes are simply due to the track being unfinished. For example, the buildings on the front straight are the same in GT3 and 4, with GT4 Prologue being the outlier. But some of it does seem to indicate that they wanted to change up the scenery and give the track a different style at one point. But regardless, the layout of the track stayed pretty much identical. However, the same can't be said for our next one. Well, here it is. I'll give you a few seconds to try and work out which circuit this eventually ended up being in GT4. Think you've got it? Well, the answer is El Capitan. If you compare this to the layout of the final version, the difference really is stark. Aside from maybe the first corner, every single turn has been changed. It resembles a tarmac rally stage much more than a road circuit, as it is in the final game. There's really no point in running through each of the changes here, because just look at it. What I will say is that it looks generally more narrow, and the far end of the circuit is a lot more technical than the final one. But even at this point, it still included some of the same buildings, but in a different position. Also, it ends with a very long flat-out section which doesn't really seem to fit the rest of the track. Despite the changes, I will admit that this layout does still sort of feel like El Capitan. I'm willing to bet that there were at least a few of you who've never seen this beta version before, but could still somehow tell it was El Capitan just from the layout alone. I wonder if this drastic change in design inspired them to make Cathedral Rocks as well. I could definitely see this track appearing in the special condition events in GT4, but I'm still glad that we got the finished version instead, given how much more usable it is. I mean, can you really imagine wrestling Group C prototypes around here? Yikes. Remember Special Stage Route 11? Well, we're not done with it quite yet. Because between GT1 and GT3, we of course have GT2, where the track was absent. But did you know that Route 11 was originally planned to be in GT2? We know this because of some very early screenshots which show the circuit appearing pretty much as it was in GT1. As for why it was eventually cut, who's to say? My personal theory is that because they already had Special Stage Route 5, they decided there was no need to have a second nighttime street circuit. So they cut Route 11 as it was the longer and more complex of the two. They would then use that extra space to instead focus on adding more all-new circuits. Of course, that would also include Rome Night, a track which is so underutilized in GT2 that it might as well be a hidden circuit. So maybe there was a different reason, who knows. Also, alongside the handful of screenshots, some actual footage of Route 11 in GT2 was randomly shown in a promotional video for GT Sport back in 2017. It's only a couple of seconds, but still pretty damn cool that we have this. As for Route 11, it's often seen as a very elusive circuit. It was in GT1, but not GT2, returned in an updated form in GT3, but was then ditched again for GT4, and hasn't come back since. I'd love to say there's also some evidence of it being in GT4 at an early stage, but it simply doesn't seem to exist. Anyway, as well as showing a previous circuit that wouldn't appear in the final game, GT2 also previewed a couple of tracks that would only debut officially in later games. This is Indy. First discovered in a demo build of GT2, this track is clearly inspired by the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, which would later appear in GT5 and GT6. But whilst its layout is clearly based on that circuit, its environment is completely original, much in the same way as Super Speedway in the final game, which is based on the Motegi Oval. It features a couple of tunnels, has a few larger buildings, and takes place at night. Indy, spelt with an I at the end, is just a placeholder name, so I wonder what it would have been called in the final release. But it's not alone here, because in those early demos, we can also find a track that goes by the name of Monte Carlo. Yep, the track that was soon to appear in GT3 under the guise of Côte d'Azur was actually planned for GT2. In the demo, it is at a very early stage, with little scenery, but it does still feature a few nice details, like the pavement texture, the raised curb at the hairpin, and the interior of the tunnel. Something that does differ between this version and how it would appear in GT3 onwards is with the Nouvelle Chicane. In this early GT2 version, it is much further down, right before the Tabac corner. This isn't at all accurate to how it was in real life, but it does somewhat resemble the version of the chicane seen only in 1972, wherein a makeshift pit lane was created on the left of the circuit, and so the chicane was temporarily moved much further down. To get around licensing the real track, it then became known as Côte d'Azur, another way of saying the French Riviera. So it is technically an original street circuit based on real roads, like Tokyo Route 246 for example. GT2 does have many other hidden tracks, but these are mostly things like unused license test routes, for example. For now, I want to move on to our next game in this video, which is Gran Turismo 5. GT5 launched in November 2010, but the story of its hidden tracks wouldn't fully start to unfold until April the following year. In February, remote races were added to GT5. This was a B-Spec mode that allowed you to race your B-Spec drivers against other people's, earning them XP and also credits for yourself. But GT Planet member Yonis made a big discovery on the remote racing section of the Gran Turismo website. They were able to find logos uploaded for 25 different circuits that had appeared in previous Gran Turismos but weren't present in GT5. Almost all of them were circuits from GT4, but there were a handful of others, like Circuit Ricardo Tormo from Tourist Trophy and GT PSP, as well as Super Speedway from GT3. As you can imagine, this sent speculation into overdrive. Were these circuits planned for future DLC? The fire had already been stoked by a trailer from the Tokyo Game Show in 2010, in which a Ferrari Enzo was seen driving at El Capitan, one of the courses whose logo was discovered here. Although in the end this would turn out to be pre-rendered footage from GT PSP that was mistakenly included in this GT5 trailer. But GT5 came and went, and with it, the only circuit to return was Twin Ring Motegi, as part of a DLC pack in 2012. But then, in June 2013, there was finally some more news, this time by Polyphony's own hand. A trailer for the Acura NSX concept in GT5 was shown at the Detroit Auto Show, and in this trailer, we could clearly see both Seattle Circuit and Apricot Hill, two tracks which had their logos found on the Gran Turismo website. Once again, the hype grew, and with GT6 already being announced, it was hoped that many more of these original circuits would return in that game. A couple of months later, Apricot Hill was confirmed to appear in GT6. Although the NSX trailer featured the GT4 version of the track, it was actually rebuilt from scratch entirely. But aside from that, not much else. After a revised midfield raceway also returned to GT6 in an update in 2015, that was it. Just 3 circuits from the list had made it back in, and with the move over to the PlayStation 4 and GT Sport, it seemed like the story had come to an end. Well, that's what we thought anyway. But whilst this was all happening, people had been digging into Gran Turismo on the PSP, and what they were able to find was data for many unused tracks from previous games. Using a cheat engine, some of these tracks could even be restored and made playable in the game. Using this experience, the folks over at the Searching for Hidden Things in GT Discord server thought that maybe something similar could be achieved with GT5, given that it shared similar code with the PSP game. And in July 2019, they made a huge breakthrough. In total, data for 81 returning unused circuits were discovered hidden in GT5. These included unique circuits from GT4 like New York and Costa di Amalfi, the GT4 versions of circuits that were remade for GT5 like Tsukuba and the Nürburgring, circuits from GT3 like Complex String and weirdly the Licensed Circle course, and even a glitchy Pikes Peak from Gran Turismo 2. It truly was one of, if not the, greatest Gran Turismo discovery ever made. Sadly, there are a few which have data but aren't playable even now, like the ever-elusive Special Stage Route 11. As of present day, the GT5 Master Mod restores 42 of these tracks, and is essentially the GT5 DLC that we never got. As for why Polyphony never released these tracks themselves, that's hard to say. It's possible that they simply didn't want to include ported over PS2 tracks, as evidenced by the few circuits that did eventually return all being redesigned for the PS3 hardware. When it comes to these tracks, Seattle Circuit is an outlier here, as it was the only track that was officially seen prior to the 2019 discovery that never returned. Also, in the trailer it appeared in, its skybox is shown to be bright daytime, as opposed to the usual evening sunset theme which it carried over from GT4. I suppose that's just another mystery to add to the pile. So those were GT5's many hidden circuits, but this game is the gift that keeps on giving, because we've somehow still got a bunch more cut tracks to talk about. Polyphony were really cooking with that NSX teaser, because our next entry was also seen there. This is Special Stage Route X, a track that was originally added as DLC in GT5. But in the Spec 2.0 update, details of a secret variation of the track were also added, simply titled Route X. A few thumbnail images of it exist in the game files as well as a course map. It uses part of the main oval, but then breaks off into its own layout of winding turns and loops. A rather bizarre looking circuit, it's unknown what its purpose would have been in the game, but the continuous cylinder sections do look like they would be a lot of fun to mess around with. Parts of the track can be seen from the main oval, but sadly none of it is drivable. And by breaking out of bounds, you can see that the rest of the course wasn't included in the final game. Before we got the wild roller coaster ride that is the Matterhorn in GT6, a circuit by the same name was planned to be included in GT5. As we can see from the course preview images, which still exist in the final game, it was going to be a gravel circuit, compared to the GT6 version which was all tarmac. We can also see from its course map that it was a completely different layout to any of the ones featured in GT6. It's worth noting that in GT5, there are references made to 3 other Matterhorn layouts, which could mean that this gravel course was intended to exist alongside the tarmac ones at some point. Even still, this track wasn't playable in the final game. Its files were included, but sadly won't load even with cheats. But a very early version of it is playable on a prototype build, featuring just the road and basic scenery. The preview images imply that at least parts of it were fairly detailed, so it's unknown just how close to finished it was before it was scrapped. But there is one track that we know was completely finished before being removed from GT5. First seen at Gamescom in 2010, Piazza del Campo was a small oval circuit located in Siena, a city in Tuscany. The track itself is actually a reference to the Palio di Siena, a horse race which takes place twice a year in the main square of Siena, Piazza del Campo. After being first seen on the 19th of August, it took not even a week before the city of Siena raised legal action because of it. The issue was to do with the use of flags representing the Contrade of Siena, basically each general district of Siena. Supposedly, Sony never got permission to use these, and this is where the problem lay. But the solution was very simple, just remove the flags. And it was reported on the 30th of August that this is exactly what was agreed. So just a minor blip in the run-up to GT5's release. It was even reported that pre-orders in Italy, and specifically Siena, had increased because of the controversy. But even so, after August 2010, the circuit was never seen again. The game released in November, and Piazza del Campo was nowhere to be seen, at least as a circuit, because it was still featured only as a photo travel location. If the issue was so easily solvable, then how come the playable circuit was ditched? Given that almost all of the footage of the circuit is shown with karts racing on it, it's believed that it would have featured in the Gran Turismo Karting Experience special event. Given this, it's possible that the course maker tracks used in that event were chosen as replacements, as the one track they had designed specifically for karts wasn't included. Whatever the reason, Piazza del Campo certainly would have been a unique circuit in GT5. In my Secret Cars video, a few people mentioned in the comments that they got to drive the Hyundai Vision GT car on GT6 at certain demo events. With that said, please let me know if you are one of the people who are at Gamescom in 2010 and got to drive at Piazza del Campo, because you would be in a very exclusive club. Now, our final cut track from GT5 in this video is a little bit different. London City Circuit debuted in GT5 Prologue as a fictional street circuit based on real London roads. One of the most notable things about it was its length, or rather, lack thereof. It measured barely over a mile long and didn't even have a pit lane. Because of these factors, many people didn't view London as a proper circuit in GT5, since its use was always limited. As such, a longer version of the London circuit would have been a great addition that would have finally made full use of the location. And I have good reason to believe that an extended London circuit did actually exist in some form. However, this is where the story goes off the rails. A few years ago, I came across a screenshot that was from either GT5 Prologue or the full GT5, depicting the GT by Citroën concept car in London. However, when looking at the road markings and the buildings, it could be determined exactly where in London the location of the in-game screenshot was. And the thing was that the real-life location where this screenshot showed was not part of the London circuit in the game, but was another road that was located relatively close to the circuit. From this, you could strongly speculate that this image was showing part of an unreleased extended London track. Or at least, that's the argument I would be making, but the problem is that after searching high and low, I can't seem to find this screenshot anywhere. So, if you have any idea what I'm talking about, please let me know if you've seen this screenshot as well, and possibly even know where to find it. I think I saw it on the GT wiki, but having scoured the website, I still couldn't locate it. Anyway, I don't want to leave this entry as a just trust me bro kind of situation, so although I can't find the screenshot in question, I do have some other proof for this extended London circuit in GT5. In an interview with IGN from April 2008, series producer Kazunori Yamauchi was asked a question about the London circuit that had appeared in GT5 Prologue, and his response to this was very interesting. To quote him directly, "The course that we have in the game at the moment is actually half the size that we originally thought. It's a short course basically, so in Gran Turismo 5 we'll have the longer course in there." So, that confirms without any doubt that a longer London circuit was planned for GT5 at some point. But whether or not work was actually started on it, and if this mystery screenshot actually depicts said work, is something that we can't be sure of. But even if it doesn't, this possible London variation is yet another thing that adds to the intrigue of Gran Turismo 5's many missing and hidden circuits. Well, that's it. Nothing can possibly top GT5 when it comes to its cut courses in terms of sheer number and variety. But there is still one more game I want to talk about, and also one track in particular. It's a story of some very unique circuit variations, tied together by possibly the most bizarre Gran Turismo Easter egg ever. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The game we're talking about is Gran Turismo 6. It's often forgotten, but GT6 also has assets left over for many of the unused circuits we eventually saw in GT5. But it does have some of its own mysteries as well. One that I can clear up right now surrounds a circuit that I've mentioned quite a few times already: Special Stage Route 11. You see, if you check out the Gran Turismo wiki, it mentions that Special Stage Route 11 was seen in a trailer for Gran Turismo 6. Now, that would be mind-blowing if it were true, but sadly this statement, whilst not being entirely wrong, is worded in a very misleading way. If we take a look at the trailer in question, the GT6 announcement trailer from May 2013, what's actually seen is merely the outline of the GT3 track layout, and not the course itself in-game. Still, this does raise some questions, since the other outlines shown in that sequence are all tracks that would appear in GT6, like Grand Valley, Suzuka, Cape Ring, etc., with Route 11 being the clear outlier. So maybe this was a sign that they did intend to include the track in GT6 initially. Or maybe they just meant to use the outline of Special Stage Route 5 or even Route 7 instead, but chose Route 11 by mistake. Either is possible. If we're looking for leaks with more credibility though, alongside the course data for the many unused tracks in GT5, GT6 added a couple more. These being Willow Springs Horse Thief Mile and Willow Springs Kart Track. Sadly, neither are drivable, but you can see each when looking from the two Willow Springs layouts that are in GT6, and the Horse Thief Mile would eventually appear in GT Sport and GT7. But now, here's the main course, my personal favourite cut track in Gran Turismo history. Gran Turismo Arena made its first, and so far only, appearance in GT6. It was a small circuit that was enclosed entirely in a stadium, kind of like the ones used for the Race of Champions or super special stages in the WRC. In GT6, this circuit is used mainly for kart racing, and only features in a handful of races in the main career. However, it also appears in a few of the returning coffee break challenges, where you can see a version of it that removes all of the barriers and other features, leaving just a barren open space. Ideal for knocking over neatly arranged cones. But for the most part, that's pretty much all GT Arena had to offer. It was hard not to feel like this location could have been used for more. I mean, it is literally a wide open stadium that they could have put anything into. So this fairly basic layout, modelled after the GT logo, did kind of feel like a waste. But we would soon find out that Polyphony originally had much bigger plans for GT Arena. In March 2016, GT Planet user Con360 discovered a couple of unique layouts for GT Arena that aren't used in the game. The first is merely the open layout. Basically, the version that's used in the coffee break cone challenges, minus the cones. But the second is far more fascinating. In this version, GT Arena has been transformed into a stunt arena, complete with ramps, boxes to smash through, and even a massive half-pipe where you could pull off some tricks. Its internal name implies that this layout was intended for a scrapped coffee break challenge, or challenges, and if so, it certainly would have made a change of pace from the usual cone-based shenanigans. Of course, nothing like this has been attempted in Gran Turismo before or since, and yet this wasn't the first time that stunt arenas had become a topic of discussion. On the run-up to GT5's release, then president of Sony Computer Entertainment, Shuhei Yoshida, leaked a couple of then unannounced details about the game. These mainly related to go-karting and stunt arenas. Go-karts would make it into GT5 as we've discussed, but the stunt arena was left on the chopping block. Does this mean that GT Arena was originally planned for GT5? Or was there another stunt arena entirely? We may never know. The same is true for the reasons why it was eventually scrapped. Maybe Polyphony thought it would be pushing the boat out too far, but remember, GT6 is the game that had the lunar rover missions, so I don't really think that's a valid excuse. If they had featured, I can guarantee that they would have been significantly less tedious than those lunar missions at least. But the story of GT Arena doesn't end there. In fact, it only gets stranger. You see, the standard layout of GT Arena was named Layout A. This implied that potentially more layouts were planned, such as Layout B, Layout C, etc. But for a while, nobody knew what these alternate layouts may have looked like, and if they even existed at all. That was until the release of GT Sports. With the switch to Sports, you may have expected that all discussions around GT Arena would have been put to bed, given that the track didn't return. But really, it just raised even more questions, thanks to a very strange reference that was included. If you went to Kyoto Driving Park Miyabi and looked into the building on the right-hand side of the pit straight, you were able to see two pictures showing a version of GT Arena that had never been seen before. Taking these images directly from the game files, we can get an even better view. It seems to show what looks like GT Arena Layout A, but with an elevated section of track that crosses over itself in a figure 8 pattern. Once again, this is nothing like any other track we've seen in this series. The only thing that comes close is kart space, I guess, but even that's not really the same. As for the layout itself, I don't imagine it would have added much more purpose to GT Arena beyond being used mostly for cards, but I still appreciate how creative this design is in terms of making an extended layout for it. This, combined with the stunt arena, really makes me wonder what other interesting ideas they might have had for GT Arena but never got around to including. So this Easter egg was only really picked up on in early 2019. But it's believed that these images have been here since GT Sport launched in 2017. It's pretty funny to think that this was sitting here in plain sight for so long before anyone really noticed. Even more so when you consider that this straight is where you take the first driving school test, and so was the first place many people even went to in this game. To avoid any doubt, these screenshots are almost certainly from GT6, not GT Sport. Next to them, we can even see an image of a C7 Corvette at the Nordschleife, which was actually a screenshot that was given to media outlets prior to GT6's release. Anyway, with the inclusion of screenshots and footage of tracks that weren't included in their final game, it really does feel like Polyphony is sometimes just trolling its players. I mean, either that, or they just keep goofing up and showing us things we weren't supposed to see. And really, that's what this all boils down to for me. Why did they even put this in the game? Now, don't get me wrong, I'm glad they did because it's really fascinating, but I just don't understand what motivation they have for doing this if it weren't simply a mistake. Because after people found out about this, inevitably they started speculating on how this could mean GT Arena is coming back as DLC for GT Sport, and of course it never did. In fact, you can boot up GT7 today, head over to Kyoto, and see these screenshots still in the game. Surely at this point it has to be intentional, but for what purpose? Regardless, those were some of the most interesting hidden and cut courses from Gran Turismo. Once again, do let me know in the comments which track you wish actually appeared in the game they were teased or leaked for the most. As I said, the GT Arena variations were the ones I found the most interesting personally, but I'm sure that many of you have different opinions. Special Stage Route 11 comes in a close second for me. For which game? Well, pretty much any of them at this point. Once again, this all goes to show that Gran Turismo holds far more secrets and mysteries than most would expect, and hopefully, as time goes on, even more could eventually be solved. Anyhow, that's about all I have to say. As always, have a good one.